The rain lashed Yorkshire in the spring of 1844. It had been falling without pause for 5 days, and the River Swale had burst its banks the night before, swallowing everything in its path: fences, trees, great chunks of earth. Grace Hartwell stood on the narrow porch of the small stone cottage, watching the muddy water creep across the pasture. She did not know how far it would reach, but she felt it in her bones. It was close, far too close. She held a sack of flour in her arms, yet her thoughts were fixed on the bridge that connected the farm to the main road. Should she try to cross before it finally gave way? The last 8 months alone had taught her to decide quickly. Since she had buried her husband, there was no one left to choose for her. It was only her now, set against the world. Then came the sound. Wood cracking, something large breaking apart. Grace dropped the sack and ran to the fence. The cursed bridge had collapsed, and caught in the wreckage was something else, a carriage tipped onto its side, being dragged by the current. The biting wind offered no mercy, and the water was already at her ankles when Grace stepped into the sodden pasture without hesitation. Her feet slipped in the mud, but she kept going when she heard it. Crying. Weak, smothered by the storm, but unmistakable. She waded in up to her knees, the cold cutting straight through her. The current tugged at her legs, trying to pull her under, but she could not stop. Not now. Grace seized the edge of the carriage, her fingers shaking. Inside were 2 babies wrapped in soaked blankets, rocking helplessly, crying in terror. And beside them, a man, unconscious, blood streaming from a deep gash on his forehead. Without thinking, Grace grabbed the basket holding the babies. She pressed it tight against her chest and fought her way back through the water, pushing against the current. The babies cried louder, frightened. The water dragged at her skirts. She stumbled, slipped, but she would not let herself fall. When she finally reached the bank, she set the basket down carefully, well clear of the rising water. The babies were safe. She was not. Grace turned at once and went back toward the carriage. The wood groaned. She heard the sharp crack of the log holding it in place. The river was about to claim everything. She stepped into the current again, deeper this time. The water struck her hard. She grabbed the man by the collar of his coat and pulled with an effort that set her arms on fire. He slid free, falling straight into the water, but now the current seemed to help. His body floated just enough. Grace caught him by the shoulders and began to drag him step by step. The river rose, pounding against her waist. Every movement tested her strength. She stumbled and fell to one side, then forced herself up again. She could not stop, not now. At last she felt cold grass beneath her feet and saw the bank ahead. She hauled him up beside her, her muscles screaming. The babies were only a few yards away, still crying. Grace looked back. The carriage tore free and was swept away, vanishing around the bend of the river, just as the horses and the driver, already drowned, had before it. She stood there gasping, staring at the babies, her whole body trembling. The rain had eased, thinning into a steady drizzle, but the ground remained heavy and treacherous beneath her feet. Grace lifted the basket again and moved farther from the river, climbing the pasture with careful steps. The wind still cut through her, carrying the scent of wet earth and storm. The baby's cries had softened, worn thin with exhaustion, yet the sound tore at the silence. Each step felt longer than the last. The weight of the basket burned her arms. When she finally reached higher ground, near the crooked fence that marked the path back to the house, she sank to her knees and set the basket down, covering the babies with her own cloak, soaked and cold. Then she turned back to the man. He lay where she had left him, unmoving, the rain reduced now to a fine mist. Water streamed down his face. Grace did not hesitate. She walked back to the bank, took hold of his shoulders and pulled again, slower now, weaker, exhaustion closing in. He was far too heavy, every movement was a struggle. But she could not stop, not now. She pulled, step by step. The sodden grass clutched at her boots, her arms burned. She felt her strength slipping away, and still she pulled once more. When she finally dragged him beside the babies, she stopped, bent over, gasping, sweat mingling with rain. They were not safe yet. But they were closer. And for now that would have to be enough. If you too cherish period stories, those that whisper like old letters and echo like longing hearts, Leave your like and subscribe to the Countess's Tales. Your support allows these narratives to cross oceans and reach more souls around the world. And before you go, tell me in the comments which city and country you're watching from. It's always enchanting to discover how far our stories travel. Chapter 1. Milk and Blood. Grace had no milk, not the kind babies draw from a mother's body. That was the first thought that struck her as she gathered the infants into her arms. They cried so hard their tiny bodies trembled, far too fragile to endure more cold, more hunger. She stripped away the soaked blankets, replaced them with dry cloths, and pressed them to her chest, offering a warmth born more of instinct than of flesh. 2 boys. Small. Perhaps 6 months old. Too alike not to be. Twins. She lifted her gaze to the man lying near the hearth. Their father, she decided. He had to be. No one crossed the country with 2 infants like that without blood tying them together, or desperation. One of the boys curled his fingers around her own with surprising strength for something so small. His hand could barely close, yet it clung stubbornly. Something tightened in Grace's chest, an old silent ache. She was 26. She had never had children. Her husband had died before such a possibility had ever existed, even as a promise. The babies needed food. Carefully, still holding both, she rose and went to the cupboard. Flour, eggs, a little honey. Nothing fit for children so young. She thought fast. Milk. Goat's milk. She had a goat in the barn, if the barn was still standing. She laid the boys in a wooden box lined with blankets near the fire, pulled her wet cloak back over her shoulders, and ran out into the rain, which had begun again in earnest. The barn still stood. The door creaked open, releasing the sharp scent of wet hay and frightened animal. The goat was there, bleating softly, eyes wide. Grace spoke to her in a calm voice, almost a whisper, as she took the pail. She sat on the low stool and began to milk quickly, her hands shaking with cold and urgency. The milk spilled warm and white, steaming in the icy air. She did not wait for the pail to fill. It was enough. She ran back. Inside, Grace shrugged off her soaked cloak and left it to dry by the fire. She warmed the milk and tested it against her skin. With a small spoon, one she used for honey, she brought a little to one baby's mouth. He hesitated, then began to suck greedily, the milk slipping from the corner of his lips. His tiny hands clenched the air, restless. The other cried louder. Grace repeated the motion, patient, spoonful by spoonful, waiting for each swallow before offering more. The cries softened, thinning into tired little sounds. Within minutes, both boys fed in silence, conquered by hunger and effort. Their eyes fluttered shut, their bodies finally eased. She breathed. Then she looked at the man. He was still unconscious. His breathing was shallow, uneven. Grace laid a hand on his forehead, far too hot. Fever. His clothes were still drenched with rain and river water, clinging to his body, stealing what little warmth he had left. If she did nothing, he would die there. So she knelt beside him and began to work, carefully unbuttoning the heavy coat, easing it from his shoulders. The fabric made a wet sound as it came away. His shirt followed, stuck to his skin. She had to pull slowly. That was when she saw it. Dark bruises bloomed across his chest and ribs, deep marks of impact. Some already purple, others still red. When she touched closer to his shoulder, his breathing hitched, and a low groan slipped from his lips. Grace frowned. This had not been a simple accident. The cut on his forehead had begun to bleed again, blood tracing down the side of his face. She rose, fetched hot water and brandy. With steady hands, she cleaned the wound and poured the alcohol over the torn skin. The man stirred faintly but did not wake. She took out needle and thread. It was not the first time she had stitched flesh. She had done the same for her husband after a scythe accident. He had died anyway, but not from the cut. Grace threaded the needle, pulled the skin together and sewed quickly, refusing to think. Blood ran warm between her fingers. When she finished, she tied the knot and bit the thread clean. She wrapped his head with strips torn from a clean sheet. Then she covered his bare torso with a dry cloth and pulled him closer to the fire, trying to give back some of the heat the river had stolen. The babies slept. Grace sank to the floor between them and the man, and stopped for the first time since the bridge had collapsed. Her hands shook, not from cold, from exhaustion, from fear, from something else she had not yet named. The house was silent, only the rain outside, striking the roof, sliding down the stone walls, and three strangers who had entered her life without asking. She studied the man again, an angular face, a strong jaw, dark hair plastered to his brow, handsome, even injured. His hands were large, calloused in strange places, not the hands of a man who merely rode horses. They were the hands of someone who knew how to fight, who had held a sword, who might have killed. Who was he, and who had tried to kill him? Grace drew her knees to her chest and watched the rain through the window. The bridge was gone. The river was still rising. No one would pass through for days, perhaps weeks. She was trapped, with a man who might be dangerous, with two babies who were not hers, and with the certainty that she had just changed her life forever. She did not yet know whether it would be for better or for worse. Chapter 2. Lies. The man woke in the middle of the night. Grace heard the groan before she even opened her eyes. She had been sitting in the chair near the hearth, her body bent forward, overcome by a weariness she had not allowed herself to answer. One of the babies slept in her arms. The other lay in the wooden box nearby, wrapped in blankets, breathing in small, steady puffs. She eased the boy back into the box and stood. The man was moving now. His eyes were open, confused, sweeping the ceiling as if searching for something that made no sense. He tried to prop himself up on one elbow and failed, a low sound of pain slipping from him. "Don't move," Grace said, firm but quiet. "You're injured." He turned his face toward her voice. In the unsteady firelight, his eyes looked almost black. He blinked several times before trying to speak. "Where?" The word came out rough, broken. "In my house. You fell into the river. I pulled you out." Silence stretched as he struggled to gather his thoughts. He looked around, the wooden beams, the hearth, the simple table. Nothing was familiar. Then his eyes widened. "The boys." He tried to rise again. Grace pushed him back without hesitation. "They're fine. Sleeping. And if you keep moving like that, you'll tear your stitches." His breathing quickened. The fear was too raw to be feigned. He looked at her then. Truly looked. He saw a young woman with brown hair tied back any which way, a plain dress stained with dried blood and mud, calloused hands, a steady stance, and tired eyes, the eyes of someone who had learned to endure alone. "Who are you?" he asked. "Grace Hartwell. This is my home." She met his gaze. "Who are you?" There was a pause, too brief to be natural. "Henry," he said at last. "Henry Barlow." A lie. Grace knew it the instant the name left his mouth. His accent was too refined. The way he held her gaze, even wounded, was not the manner of a man used to obeying, and the crest on his coat, now draped over the back of the old chair by the fire, belonged to no Barlow she knew. But she said nothing. "You were attacked," she went on. "Do you remember what happened?" Henry closed his eyes. The images came in fragments. The narrow road, the hedgerow bursting open, 4 men, weapons, the crack of a shot, the driver collapsing from the seat before he could cry out, the reins slipping free, the horses screaming in panic, the bridge appearing too fast, the fall, the icy water, the babies crying. "I remember," he murmured. "Who did this to you?" "I don't know." Another lie. Grace folded her arms slowly. She knew lies. She had lived with them for years, about money, about debts, about absences explained too late. "The boys are yours?" she asked. He opened his eyes again and looked toward the box near the hearth. Something shifted in his face. The hardness eased, replaced by something raw and unguarded. "They are. And their mother. Dead." The word fell flat, final. Grace recognized the tone. It was the same one she used when someone asked about her husband. "The bridge collapsed," she said. The river took everything. There's no way out until the rain stops and the water goes down. It could take days. Henry looked toward the window. Outside only darkness and the heavy sound of rain striking the glass. "You're alone here?" he asked. "I am." "No husband?" "He died." He nodded once. He understood not to go further. Silence settled between them. Grace stirred the fire, added another log. The flames leapt higher, lighting his face more clearly. There were old scars, above his brow, along his chin, the marks of fights that did not belong to an ordinary man. "I need to leave," he said suddenly. "I need to get the boys somewhere safe." "You can barely keep your eyes open," Grace replied. "You're not going anywhere." "You don't understand." His voice dropped. "They'll come back." Cold slid down her spine. "Who will?" Henry did not answer. His jaw tightened, his eyes closed. His breathing turned uneven as the fever reclaimed him. Grace touched his forehead. Burning. She stood, soaked a cloth in cold water, and laid it over him. Henry no longer reacted. He had slipped back into unconsciousness. Grace knelt beside him for a moment, watching. Whoever this man was, he was afraid, truly afraid. And he had carried that fear into her house, along with 2 innocent babies. She looked at the box. The boys slept peacefully, unaware of everything. So small, so fragile. Grace drew a slow breath. She could not send them away. Not with the bridge destroyed, not with a wounded man, not with children who would freeze outside. But she could not ignore the warning either. They'll come back. She rose, went to the door and locked it. Then she took her late husband's old shotgun from the wall, checked the load. It was ready. She set it beside the chair, and she sat down to wait for dawn. Chapter 3. Fever. The fever lasted 2 days. Henry drifted in and out of delirium. He spoke in fragments, names Grace did not recognize, orders delivered with the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Protect the carriage," he murmured. "Don't let them get near the boys." At times he shouted, waking the babies, setting them crying until their voices grew hoarse. Grace pressed cold cloths to his forehead, changing them again and again. When he was awake enough to swallow, she forced him to drink water. He fought her, knocked her hand aside, muttered that it was poison, that he could not trust her. Grace held fast, spoke softly, repeated the same words until he gave in. The babies cried, fed, slept, the simple rhythm of survival. Between one task and the next, Grace changed their improvised nappies, strips torn from old sheets, folded with care and fastened as best she could. Within hours, she learned to tell them apart without thinking. One bore a small mark behind his left ear, the other did not. She began to think of them as James and John, silently, only to keep from confusing them. She did not know their real names. Henry was in no condition to tell her. On the second night, the fever worsened. Henry shook so violently his teeth chattered, a dry, unsettling sound. Grace piled every blanket she owned over him, fed the fire until the heat grew almost suffocating. It did no good. His skin remained cold despite the sweat. Without thinking too much, she lay down beside him, pressed her body against his, trying to lend him warmth. Henry murmured something incoherent, turned instinctively, and buried his face against her neck. Grace went still. Her heart raced, too loud in her chest. It was not the first time she had shared a bed with a man, but it had been 8 months since the last, and this was different. There was no desire here, no choice, only necessity, urgency, a kind of intimacy that did not ask permission. She closed her eyes and stayed where she was, breathing slowly until his trembling eased. By dawn, the fever had broken. Henry woke drenched in sweat, weak and disoriented. It took him a few seconds to realize where he was, and a few more to notice Grace beside him. He pulled away at once, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice rough. "I didn't... You had a fever." "You were shaking," she replied simply. "I was only trying to help." He nodded slowly, still unable to meet her eyes. He tried to sit up and groaned in pain. Grace rose and went to the stove. She returned with a bowl of broth she had made the night before. "Eat." Henry obeyed. He drank slowly, as if each swallow required effort, still weak, but better. Color was beginning to return to his face. "The boys?" he asked. "They're fine. Eating, sleeping, doing what babies do." He looked toward the box near the hearth. The two slept curled together, their breathing soft, perfectly matched. Something crossed his face, and relief, fear, love, all tangled together. Grace watched in silence. "What are their names?" she asked. "Thomas and William." "Which is which?" "Thomas has the mark behind his ear." Grace smiled faintly. "I was calling him James." Henry almost smiled too. Almost. "How old are they?" she asked. 6 months, nearly 7. Silence lingered for a moment. Then Grace asked the question she had been avoiding. "You still haven't told me who you really are." Henry lowered his eyes to the empty bowl, ran his thumb along the rim, thoughtful. "Does it matter?" "It might," she said. "Especially if the men who tried to kill you come here." He looked up. Something had changed. The softness was gone. What remained was hardness, alertness, danger. "If they come," he said, "you tell them you know nothing, that you didn't see me, that you didn't see the children, do you understand? And if they don't believe me, they will." His voice was steady. "You're just a widow alone on an isolated farm. You have no reason to lie." Grace narrowed her eyes. "But I would be lying." "To protect us? From what? From whom?" Henry drew a slow breath, as if choosing each word with care. "From people who kill without hesitation, people who don't care who stands in their way." Fear settled deep in Grace's stomach. "Who are you, really?" she pressed. Henry looked at his sleeping sons, then at her. "Someone who should be dead," he said. Nothing more. He lay back down, turning his face toward the wall. The conversation was over. Grace remained where she was, watching the tense line of his back, the man who had brought secrets and danger into her home, and she wondered whether she had done the right thing in saving him, or whether, in pulling him from the river, she had just signed her own death warrant. Chapter 4. Thomas. Grace woke to the sound of crying. She rose at once, still heavy with sleep. Thomas was crying in the box, his face flushed, his small body restless. William was already awake, watching his brother with eyes far too large for someone so small. She lifted Thomas into her arms. He was hot, far too hot. Fever. Grace's heart tightened. Babies with fever could worsen quickly. She had seen it before. Neighbors' children, little ones who seemed fine in the morning and were gone by nightfall. Henry was awake. "What is it?" he asked, trying to sit up. "Fever. Thomas has a fever." The color drained from his face. He forced himself to his feet, ignoring the pain that tore through him. He staggered to the table and braced himself against it to keep from falling. "Let me see." Grace handed the baby over. Henry held his son with almost reverent care, touched the small forehead. "Burning." "Since when?" "Just now." He looked around the house as if searching for an answer hidden within the stone walls. There was nothing, no doctor, no medicine, only isolation. "Do you have anything?" he asked. "Anything at all?" Grace shook her head. "Nothing meant for babies. I can only try to bring the fever down." "Then do it." She took Thomas back, soaked a cloth in cold water, and wrapped the tiny body with care. His cry came out weak, different. Not hunger, not ordinary discomfort. It was a sound that chilled the blood. Grace sat down, holding him to her chest, and began to sing softly. An old song, learned from her mother. It spoke of stars, of angels, of rest. Simple words repeated like a prayer. Henry stood by the table, helpless, wounded, watching his son suffer with nothing he could do. "He'll be all right," Grace said, never taking her eyes from Thomas. "Children get fevers. It's common." "Are you sure?" She hesitated. Only a second. "No." The honesty hurt more than any lie could have. Henry closed his eyes, fists clenched. The memory came unbidden, the night of the birth. Catherine too pale, The blood that would not stop, the doctors whispering. Him holding the newborn boys while losing the woman he loved. He could not lose a child too, not after everything. He drew a deep breath and lowered himself back into the chair. He picked up William. The baby settled at once, safe, unaware of his father's fear. The hours passed far too slowly. The fever did not break. Grace changed the cloths again and again, coaxed Thomas to swallow a few drops of water. He turned his head away, cried weakly. She persisted with tireless patience, celebrating each tiny swallow. Henry did not move. He held William, but his eyes never left Thomas. He counted breaths, watched every whimper, every smallest movement. "Their mother," Grace said suddenly, breaking the silence. "How did she die?" Henry took his time before answering. "In childbirth," he said quietly. "The boys were born well, small but strong. She was exhausted but happy. She held them, smiled, and then the bleeding began." Grace kept tending to Thomas, but she heard every word. "We sent for doctors. They tried everything, but it wouldn't stop. She grew cold." He swallowed. "I held her hand until the end. She never stopped smiling. Said it had been worth it. Said they were perfect." "What was her name?" Grace asked. "Catherine. Did you love her?" "More than I ever thought it possible to love another person." "I'm sorry." He breathed in before asking, "And your husband?" Grace replaced the cloth on Thomas's forehead. "Fever. It started simply, a cough, aches. We thought it would pass. 5 days later he was dead." "How long ago?" 8 months. Henry nodded slowly. "It's hard." "It is." Silence returned, but it was no longer heavy. It was shared. Then Thomas stopped crying. Grace felt it before she saw it. She touched the baby's forehead carefully. Cooler. "It's breaking," she murmured, her voice unsteady. Henry released the breath he had been holding for hours. "Are you sure?" "I'll keep watching him, but—" "Yes." He rose with effort and came closer, watched Thomas sleeping in her arms, the way Grace held him, steady, instinctive, as if she had always done this. Something shifted inside him. "Thank you," he said softly. "For them. For me. For not letting us die in that river." "Anyone would have done the same," Grace replied. Henry shook his head. "No. They wouldn't have." Grace looked away, unsettled by the weight of his gratitude. Henry sat back down. He was exhausted, injured, but his sons were alive. And for now that was enough. Grace kept rocking Thomas even after he fell into a deep sleep. She did not want to let him go. Not yet. It had been a long time since she had felt needed. And with a quiet ache in her chest, she realized she did not want that moment to end. Chapter 5. Routine. The days that followed were strange. Grace cared for the babies as if they were her own. She fed them, changed them, soothed them when they cried. She did it without much thought, as if her body knew what to do before her mind did. Henry helped where he could, but he was still weak. The wound on his forehead throbbed, and the bruises on his chest worsened before they began to fade. They fell into a routine without ever discussing it. Grace rose early, milked the goat, prepared the thin porridge. Henry stayed with the babies while she was gone. When she returned, they traded places. He ate, she tended to the children. At night, they shared the vigil. One slept while the other stayed awake, listening for any cry, any movement. It was too domestic. Grace realized it on the 4th day, and the thought unsettled her. She pushed it away at once. It meant nothing. It was circumstance, nothing more. But there were moments, small ones, nearly invisible. When she entered the room and found Henry seated by the hearth, Thomas asleep on his chest, and he hummed softly a wordless melody. Or when he watched her cross the room with William in her arms and smiled, faint, weary but real. Dangerous moments. Grace could not allow herself to feel anything. He would leave as soon as he could. He would take his sons. He would return to his life, whatever that life truly was. And she would remain, alone again. As always. On the 5th day, Henry managed to walk to the door without staggering. He stood there, watching. The river had receded considerably. The water was slowly reclaiming its natural course, leaving behind mud, branches, broken fences. Crossing was still impossible, but soon it would not be. "A few more days," he said. Grace stood behind him, William in her arms. "And then?" Henry did not answer at once. "Where will you go?" she asked. "I don't know yet." "You need to know," she said. "You can't keep running forever." He turned to her. There was exhaustion in his eyes, and something deeper. Fear, perhaps. "You don't understand the situation. Then explain it to me." Henry hesitated. He looked at William, then at Grace. He drew a breath, as though stepping over an invisible line. "What do you know about the English nobility?" Grace frowned. "Enough to know it tends to cause more problems than it solves." The ghost of a smile appeared, then vanished. "I am a duke." The word landed heavy. "The Duke of Somerville. I inherited the title a year ago, when my father died. Along with it came the estates, the responsibilities, and an enemy." Grace went still. William shifted in her arms, tugging at a loose strand of her hair. "You're a duke," she repeated, testing the sound. "I am. And you lied to me." "I did." She shook her head slowly, trying to rearrange everything in her mind. "Why would someone want to kill a duke?" Henry held her gaze. "Money, power, revenge." A pause. "My cousin is next in line. If I die, he inherits everything. And if my sons die with me, there's no one left to challenge it." Cold slid down Grace's spine. Was it him? "I have no proof." His voice hardened. "But I am certain. And what will you do?" Henry turned back to the river, as if the current might offer answers. "Survive. Keep my sons alive. Prove he is behind it." "How?" "I don't know yet." Grace fell silent. William yawned and rested his head against her shoulder. "You can't go home," she said at last. "Not while he's still out there." "I know." "Then you need somewhere safe, somewhere no one would think to look." Henry turned to her, truly looked. He saw the resolve, the quiet strength. A woman who had survived loss and remained whole. "Are you offering?" Grace hesitated. It was reckless, dangerous, madness, but she looked at William in her arms, at Thomas sleeping in the box, at Henry, wounded, exhausted, desperate. "At first I thought whoever was after you might be someone local," she said slowly. "But if it's your cousin, you'll be safer here. I don't think he knows this place exists. And they likely believe you all died in the river with the carriage. It's imprudent, but you may stay. For how long? Weeks, perhaps months. And if they find us? They won't. No one knows this place. There's no reason to search an isolated farm in the middle of Yorkshire." Grace drew a deep breath, thought of her husband, of the silent house, of days that stretched too long. "All right. You may stay." Henry stared at her, stunned. "Why?" Grace looked down at the baby in her arms, brushed a finger over his warm, soft cheek. "Because no one deserves to die," she said. Then quietly, "Especially not children." Henry stepped closer, too close. Grace felt the heat of his body, the clean scent of recently used soap. "Thank you," he said softly. She lifted her eyes and saw too much. The scar above his brow, the unshaven jaw, the restrained intensity. She stepped back. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "We may all die anyway." Henry smiled. Small. Genuine. The first one. "Always so optimistic?" "Always realistic." He laughed, a low, rough, unexpected sound, and it echoed in Grace's mind long after he had returned to his chair. She turned to the window, pretending to watch the pasture, but her heart was beating far too fast, and she knew with a clarity that frightened her that she had just made two mistakes, agreeing to hide them, and beginning to care. Chapter 6. The Letter. The weeks passed. The river returned to its normal course. The bridge remained destroyed, but Henry improvised a crossing with planks and rope tied from one bank to the other. It was not pretty. It was not safe. But it worked, for anyone who crossed slowly, on foot, heart lodged in their throat. Grace went to her father's farm only once. She needed supplies. She needed to appear normal. She invented a simple story: the flood, the fallen bridge, provisions lost to the rain. Her father asked if she was all right up there on her own. Grace said she was. She said it with the firmness she had learned after grief, the kind that asked for no comfort. She did not mention Henry, nor Thomas and William. When she returned, she found Henry on the porch with both babies. They had already changed, heavier in the arms, more alert to the world, quicker to recognize her voice. When Grace appeared climbing the pasture, Henry smiled, a smile that no longer held surprise but habit. "Did you get everything?" "Flour, eggs, salt. Clean cloths for nappies and a little sugar." She went inside and set the sacks on the table. Henry followed, laid the babies in the box that now lived permanently near the hearth, as if that corner had become the heart of the house. "Did your father ask anything?" he murmured. "Only if I was all right." "Did he believe you?" "I think so. He knows me, knows I don't like to depend on anyone." Henry nodded. He watched Grace put the supplies away, arranging each sack with almost nervous care. There was something different about her today, a thread of tension that had not been there yesterday. "Grace." She stopped and turned. "What?" Henry drew a breath and ran a hand through his hair. A gesture she recognized. He did that when he was about to say something he feared. "I need to tell you something." Grace's stomach tightened. "What is it?" "I sent a letter." The words fell into the kitchen like a heavy object. Grace set the sack of flour down hard on the table. "When?" "Last week. One afternoon when you dozed off with the boys, I walked to the village and found a passing courier, one of those who travel long routes. I asked him to carry the letter to the city 2 days from here and to wait for a reply, then bring it back to the same place." Heat rushed up her spine too fast. For a moment the world blurred at the edges. "How did you pay him?" Grace asked sharply. "You had no money." Henry hesitated. He touched the cuff of his shirt. "I gave him one of my cufflinks. Gold. An old crest." His voice dropped. "The last thing of value I still had with me. And that didn't draw attention." "Not to him." Henry held her gaze. "It was just gold. Enough to buy silence and patience. You sent a letter without telling me." "I had to. And if they trace it, if they find where you are, where we are—" "They won't," he said firmly. "He doesn't know who I am, or who I wrote to. He only knew where to return if there was an answer." She finally lifted her eyes to him. Hard now. "If anyone comes here," she said, "you take your children and you leave. You don't drag me any further into this. Do you understand? My father would hate to have trouble knocking at his door." Henry met her gaze. "I understand." But they both knew. If anyone came, it would already be too late, for all of them. Grace went outside with William in her arms. She needed air. She needed to remember how breathing felt before fear tightened her chest. Henry stayed inside with Thomas. He looked down at his son and whispered, as if the baby might forgive him. "I'm sorry." Thomas yawned and drifted back to sleep. That night, Grace barely slept. She lay in the narrow bed listening to Henry move near the hearth. He slept on the floor now. The babies in their box beside him. A small world guarded by a man who trusted not even his own name. Grace thought of everything that could go wrong. The letter intercepted. Men arriving in the dark. Blood on the wood. She thought of leaving. Going to her father's house. Leaving Henry to his own trouble. But then she thought of Thomas and William. Of small hands gripping her fingers. Of their new smiles. She could not abandon them. Outside, the rain had returned, tapping softly against the roof. And for the first time in months, Grace prayed. She prayed the letter would arrive, that there would be proof, that it would all end, because a truth was beginning to take shape inside her, silent and terrifying. She was growing attached. not only to the babies, to him as well, and that was more dangerous than any enemy who might one day cross the pasture. Chapter 7. Midnight. The letter arrived in the middle of the night. Grace woke to violent knocking at the door, hard, insistent. Her heart leapt into her throat. She sat up in bed, cold all over, and glanced through the crack of the bedroom door. Henry was already on his feet, tense, his hand wrapped around the hilt of the knife he kept within reach. "Stay with the children," he whispered without turning. Grace crossed the house barefoot and lifted Thomas and William from the box. She pressed them to her chest and retreated to the bedroom, hiding behind the door, her breathing shallow, as if air itself had become precious. Henry went to the entrance, drew a steadying breath, unlatched the door, opened it slowly. It was the young, thin man he had met on the road weeks before, soaked through by rain, dressed as a courier. He clutched a sealed envelope beneath his coat, as though the paper itself might save his life. "Are you Henry Barlow?" "I am." The courier held out the envelope with trembling hands. "From London," the man said, rain dripping from his hair. "You asked me to wait for the reply and deliver it in person. I came back as soon as it was placed in my hands." Henry took the letter, felt its weight. From his pocket he produced the second gold cufflink and placed it in the man's palm, far more than agreed upon. "You were never here," Henry said quietly. "You didn't see me. Do you understand?" The courier pocketed the cufflink at once. "I understand, sir. I saw nothing." And he vanished into the rainy darkness. Henry shut the door, locked it. Only then did Grace step out of the bedroom, the babies still in her arms. What was it? The reply. He went to the table and lit another candle. His hands shook as he broke the seal. He read quickly. The color drained from his face. "Henry," Grace said softly, "what does it say?" He read it again, more slowly this time, as if his mind refused to accept it. Then he crushed the paper in his fist. "He has proof," Henry said, his voice low, hard. "When he received my letter, he didn't answer right away. First he went where I couldn't. He used his name, his connections. Asked questions I couldn't ask without drawing attention. Grace stood still, listening. He followed the money, old payments made under false names. Then he found the men who attacked the carriage. 2 had already fled. 1 was too drunk to keep his mouth shut." Henry drew a breath. Through him he reached the others, 3 witnesses, all pointing to the same man. "My cousin," Grace murmured. "My cousin," Henry confirmed. "There are documents signed by intermediaries tied to him. Payment records, dates, places. Everything matches the day of the attack." He closed his eyes for a moment as though the weight of certainty was worse than doubt. It wasn't an accident, it wasn't robbery, it was an order, planned and paid for. Cold spread through Grace's body. "So now you know." "Now I know," Henry said. "And he knows someone has started looking where they shouldn't. That's why I can't wait. If I stay still, I become a target again." Grace released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That's good," she said. "Now you can expose him." Henry set the letter down and dragged his hands over his face. "It's not that simple." He looked at her, fear plain in his eyes. "He has friends, judges, lords, men in high places. If I accuse him without protection, he destroys me, or kills me before I reach any court. Then, what will you do?" Henry lifted his gaze. There was resolve there, and something like sorrow. "I have to go to London in person. I need to place this in the hands of someone he cannot touch." "Who?" Henry hesitated, not for drama, but as if the word itself carried danger. "The Duke of Wellington." Grace's eyes widened. The name felt too large for that small kitchen. "You know, Wellington?" "My father served under him before he inherited the title," Henry said quietly. "Once, during a campaign, he pulled a man out of crossfire." Wellington never forgot. He paused, and the next words came like a blade drawn slow. "If I reach him, he doesn't need to hide me. He only needs to do what he's always done better than any man alive. Open the right door. A magistrate, a minister, a place where this letter won't vanish and where my cousin can't buy silence." Grace's stomach twisted. So you want to reach him, to reach someone greater than your cousin? Henry nodded. So the Crown looks at this with clean eyes. And when that happens, my cousin falls. When are you leaving? Henry glanced toward the window. The sky was beginning to pale, not dawn yet, but the end of night. At first light, the longer I stay, the more I endanger you, and them. Grace's chest caved inward in a place she did not want to name. And the children? Henry did not answer at once. He looked at his sons, too small to understand they were targets. I'll take them with me. Grace stepped forward, her voice low, fierce. You're mad. The road, the cold, people who might recognize you. If anything happens on the way, I can't leave them here. You can. She tightened her hold on Thomas and William, as if her own body might shield them. Leave them with me. Go settle this. Come back when it's safe. Henry shook his head. I can't ask that of you. I've already asked too much. You're not asking, Grace said, holding his gaze. I'm offering. He looked at her and saw what he may have refused to see for weeks. She was already part of their survival. Grace, I'll care for them, as I have been, as if they were mine, until you return. Henry stepped closer. He cupped her face in both hands, careful not to wake the babies. His eyes searched hers, as though he were trying to memorize every line. You are the most extraordinary person I've ever known. Grace felt her heart race, the warmth of his hands, the closeness. Go, she whispered, before I change my mind. Henry smiled, small, sad, real. Then, as if it were the only promise he could make without words, he bent and kissed her forehead. 1 second, 2, 3. When he pulled away, Grace was breathless, not from romance, but from fear of what it meant. I'll be back in 2 weeks, Henry said roughly. 3 at most, I promise. And if you don't? I will. But neither of them was certain. Henry gathered his things, dry coat, boots, a bag, with what little he owned. He paused at the door and looked back one last time. Grace stood in the center of the room with Thomas and William in her arms. Candlelight carved her features in gold and shadow. Beautiful, he realized. Not the beauty of salons, but of endurance, of someone who holds. Take care of them, he said. I will. At first light, Henry was ready. The sky still carried the remnants of night, a cold grey promising an uncertain day. He fastened his coat, adjusted his boots, slung the bag over his shoulder. There was nothing left to say. He nodded once, as if the moment were both a blessing and a sentence. He opened the door. Before stepping out, he hesitated, still looking at her. One last silent glance, heavy with everything they had not dared to name. Then he walked into the pale morning light. Grace stood where she was, listening to his footsteps fade, the whinny of the horse, the sound of hooves sinking into wet earth. And then, silence. He was gone. Chapter 8. Waiting. Grace stood on the porch with Thomas and William in her arms and watched Henry ride down the hill on the horse he'd managed to recover from the pasture. He looked back once, only once. Then he disappeared around the bend in the road. She stayed there long after he was gone. The babies cried. She went inside, fed them, changed them, soothed them. She did it on instinct, her hands moving while her thoughts drifted elsewhere, down dangerous roads, into ambushes, into the hands of armed men. The first weeks were hard. Thomas and William felt their father's absence. They cried more, slept less. They woke in the night searching for him. Grace spent those nights awake, holding them both, humming the same wordless tunes Henry used to hum. Slowly, they adjusted. So did Grace. She began to think of them as hers. When she was alone, she called them my boys. She spoke to them as if they could understand, told them made-up stories about knights and dragons. She sang the songs her mother had taught her. She laughed when they made ridiculous little noises, or when Thomas tried to crawl and toppled over with offended determination. 2 weeks passed, and Grace thanked God, silently, that the pantry still held enough. Henry didn't return. She tried not to imagine the worst. but the possibilities haunted her at night. He might have been killed on the road, or arrested. Or his cousin might have reached the witnesses first, uncovered everything, bought their silence. 3 weeks, nothing. One afternoon, while the boys slept, Grace went to her father's farm and asked if there was any news from London. Nothing important, they said, just rumours. Talk of a dispute among noblemen, a duke accusing another of conspiracy. Nothing confirmed. On the way back, she saw 2 riders stopped near the fallen fence, speaking with a neighbour. One of them looked toward her for too long. Grace felt her blood turn to ice. She lowered her face, tightened her shawl, and kept walking as if it were nothing but wind. But when she reached home, she locked the door with trembling hands and understood that no one would look here had always been hope, not certainty. 4 weeks. Grace stopped counting the days. With a dull ache lodged in her chest, she accepted that he wasn't coming back. That something had gone wrong. That Henry was dead, or imprisoned, or running somewhere far away. She accepted, too, that Thomas and William were hers now, and it hurt more than she'd expected. Not only because of the burden of raising 2 babies alone, not only because she would have to invent a story for her father, for the neighbours about where they had come from, but because of losing him, Henry. Because at some point, without noticing, without meaning to, she had begun to feel something for him. Something she hadn't felt since her husband died, something beyond gratitude or compassion, something dangerous. And now, he was gone. Grace was alone again, with 2 babies who were not hers, with secrets she couldn't speak aloud, and with a heart that ached in ways she didn't fully understand. On a cold morning, as she fed the boys, she let herself cry, quietly so she wouldn't frighten them. She cried for the unfairness of it all, for saving a man only to lose him, for growing attached to children who would have been taken from her either way, for letting herself feel again. Thomas looked up at her with dark eyes, so like his father's, and reached out a small hand. He touched her cheek, curious about the tears. Grace took that tiny hand and kissed it. "We'll be all right," she whispered. "All 3 of us. We will." And she tried to believe it. In the 5th week, Grace woke to the sound of hooves. She sat up in bed, heart hammering. It was still early. The sun had barely risen. Who would ride up there at such an hour? She threw on her robe and went to the window. 1 horse, 1 man dismounting. Grace recognized the posture before she saw the face. Henry. Relief hit so hard she had to grip the window frame. Alive. He was alive. Whole. She didn't think. She ran outside barefoot, not caring about the cold or the mud, and flew down the porch steps. He dismounted before she reached him. Grace threw herself into his arms without thought for propriety or sense. Henry caught her, held her tight, pressed her to his chest. She felt his heart racing, felt his hands in her hair. "You're here," she said into his shoulder, voice breaking. For one terrifying second she'd feared another messenger. For 1 second she'd feared she'd dreamed him. "I'm here." "I'm all right." They stayed like that a long moment, Grace breathing him in, horse and road and sweat, but alive. He was alive. At last she pulled back and wiped her eyes quickly. "It took too long," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. I know." His throat worked. "I'm sorry. It was more complicated than I expected." "Did you do it?" Henry smiled, wide with relief, but tired around the eyes. "I did, but not quietly." Wellington opened the right door, and when it opened, all of London heard. Grace's legs nearly gave with relief. "Thank God." "And now I can go home," he said, the words simple. "To Somerville, with my sons." Grace's heart sank, sharp and immediate. Of course, he would take them. It had always been obvious. It had always been the truth. "They're well," she said softly, forcing her voice not to tremble. "They've grown. Thomas is truly starting to crawl now. William laughs when I make faces at him." Henry looked toward the house, anxiety and love braided together on his face. "May I see them?" "Yes," Grace said quickly. "Of course." They went in together. The babies lay in the sitting room, in a larger box Grace had cobbled together to fit them now. They were still asleep, curled close as always. Henry stopped in the doorway. He simply stared at them. His children, whom he hadn't seen in more than a month. Then he knelt by the box and reached out, touching Thomas's hair, then William's. They stirred, waking slowly. When they opened their eyes and saw him, William made a small, wavering sound. Thomas reached out both arms. Henry lifted them, gathered them close against his chest. "I missed you," he said, voice splitting. "I missed you so much." Grace turned away, pretending to straighten something on the table. She didn't want him to see the tears. She didn't want him to know how much it hurt. In the days that followed, there was too much silence and too few words. Henry stayed, at first because he needed to, then because he seemed not to know how to leave again. The house held two adult presences once more, but it did not return to the rhythm it had before. Something had changed in the space of his absence, something neither of them yet knew how to name. In that uncertain space, between relief and waiting, between what they had been and what they might become, time began to move differently. Henry was no longer fragile, no longer desperate. He spoke easily of London, of solicitors, of estates, of urgent repairs needed at the main house. He mentioned servants who would have to be hired, lands that needed reorganizing, accounts demanding attention. He spoke like a duke. Grace listened in silence. She kept preparing meals, tending to the babies, keeping the routine. But day by day she felt a distance that wasn't physical. It was something else, subtle, sharp. He had returned. But the man who had left, wounded, vulnerable, dependent, that man hadn't come back whole. One bright afternoon, Henry stood on the porch with William in his arms, speaking distractedly, not quite hearing the weight of his own words. "I'll need to hire a nurse," he said, "someone experienced. Somerville is large and they'll need constant care while I handle the business." Grace was in the kitchen with her hands in cold water. She stopped. A nurse. Of course. It was sensible. It was expected. Dukes didn't raise their own children alone. There were people for that. She said nothing. She went back to scrubbing the dishes, her movements automatic. Henry went on, still not noticing. "And a tutor, later, when they're older. Latin, mathematics, everything expected of heirs." He didn't notice her silence until William shifted in his arms, and Grace didn't come, as she always did, to take the baby, to smile, to lighten the moment. Henry faltered, the sentence dying in his throat. "Grace," he called softer. She appeared in the kitchen doorway, hands still wet, her face steady, her gaze distant. Henry understood with cruel delay that London had taken more than time. It had returned to him the old discipline, the one that taught him to speak of grand things, so he wouldn't have to speak of what hurt. "I wasn't replacing you," he said, voice rough now, stripped of any pose. "I was trying to make sure nothing takes them from us again, and I did it the way I was trained to, thinking in hires, in rules, in plans." Grace didn't answer, but Henry saw the damage anyway, in the way she didn't move, in the silence that wasn't defiance, but retreat. And behind the firmness of her face, he recognized something that struck deeper than any accusation. The fear of becoming temporary, useful, easily replaced. Grace dried her hands slowly, as if she needed to finish that one small act before she accepted what she already knew. She walked to the window. Outside, the pasture stretched too peacefully for a heart on edge. She saw Henry rocking William, pointing toward something on the horizon, explaining something the baby would never understand. William laughed, enchanted by the sound of his voice, by the motion, by the safety of that embrace. And then Grace understood, not with anger, not with bitterness, with a cold, final clarity. Everything she'd lived here, the sleepless nights, the constant fear, the intimacy forged by urgency, had been an interval, a parenthesis opened by necessity, held up by danger, and closed the moment order returned. Henry was stepping back into his world. And his world had rules and titles and structures, places designed for everything and except her. When he returned fully to Somerville, to the space that had always been his by right, there would be no place for Grace Hartwell. There would be nurses, tutors, servants, decorum. and she would become nothing more than the story told afterward. Grace set the cloth down on the table, not in haste, not in drama. She crossed the house in silence and slipped out the back door. She walked through the pasture to the still fallen fence. The river ran calm now, contained, obedient, as if it had never threatened to destroy everything. She rested her hands on the cold wood and drew a deep breath. She had survived loss before. She would survive it again. And this time she would not wait for someone else to decide when it was time to leave. She thought of her life before Henry arrived. It had been lonely, hard, but it had been hers. She had survived her husband's death. She had survived alone on that land, without help, without promises. She had been strong enough for that. She would be strong again. Grace breathed in, feeling cold air fill her lungs. She would not ask to stay. She would not beg for a place in anyone's life. She would not make herself smaller just to remain needed. If Henry left with his sons, she would endure. And with that certainty, hard, silent, complete, she turned back toward the house. Chapter 9. The Request. Before he said a single word, Grace saw it. Henry sat near the hearth with Thomas sprawled across his chest and William propped against his arm. He was doing nothing remarkable, just laughing softly when one of the boys tugged at the button of his shirt, an unguarded, genuine laugh, the kind that cannot be rehearsed. The sight struck her without warning, not because it was rare, but because it no longer was. He looked at home, not as a visitor, not as a guest, as someone who belonged to that space as fully as she did. Grace felt her chest tighten. That was dangerous. She looked away too quickly, like someone caught wanting what they shouldn't. It was exactly the kind of image she needed to erase before he left, the kind of memory that would make goodbye unbearable. That was why she began to tidy, why she kept her hands busy. Because if she stayed still, if she allowed herself to watch for even a few more seconds, everything she had been building inside herself, her careful acceptance of loss, would collapse before it was ever tested. She was ready to lose them. Then he said her name. Grace. She stopped. The way he said it, low, steady, weighted with intent, cut deeper than it should have, breaking the fragile normalcy she was trying to hold together. She drew a breath, wiped her face quickly, as if she could erase any trace of what she felt, squared her shoulders, prepared herself to hear what she expected, farewells, plans, practical explanations. Look at me. Grace turned slowly. Henry was on his feet now, Thomas and William in his arms, both of them pressed against his chest, safe, content. That image, so simple and so impossible, made something contract inside her. He looked at her with an intensity that did not match the calm of his voice. There was no rush, no anxiety. There was decision. Come with me. Grace blinked, confused. For a moment she thought she had misheard. What? To Somerville. He drew a breath as if finally speaking something he had been holding back for weeks. Not as a favor, not as charity, as a choice. Grace's heart pounded too hard. She shook her head almost on instinct. I can't. Why not? The words came before she could soften them. Because this isn't my world. Because you're a duke and I'm just a farmer's widow. Because it will swallow me whole. She expected him to argue quickly, to soften it, to promise it would be easy. Instead, Henry watched her in silence for a moment. Then he spoke, calm, firm, without romance. For 5 weeks everyone told me what I should do, which political alliances to form, which marriages would be convenient, which name would best protect the title. A tired half-smile touched his mouth. And in every one of those conversations I thought of you, of this house, of my sons sleeping safely here, of who was with them when I wasn't. Grace felt her chest tighten. That's gratitude, she murmured, more to shield herself than out of conviction. Henry shook his head. No gratitude fades. He stepped closer. What I felt when I imagined you here alone, that didn't fade for a single day. She looked away. Even if I felt something, her voice faltered, it wouldn't change anything. It changes everything. He moved closer, careful to respect her space but unwilling to retreat. Because I'm not asking you to fit into my world, Grace. I'm asking you to come with me and change it. A weak laugh escaped her, almost a sob. And how do you imagine that? Henry hesitated only a second. The only way that makes sense. He drew a breath. Marry me, Grace. Be officially the mother of my sons. Be my wife. Silence fell, heavy, dense, full of everything left unsaid. That's madness, she whispered. I don't know how to be a duchess. I wasn't raised for it. I know, Henry smiled faintly. And that is exactly why I need you. Tears came before Grace could stop them. They'll judge me, she said. Not just me, you, the boys. They'll say I don't belong, that I'm a mistake you'll need to correct. There will be no correction. It will be a scandal, her voice broke. For society, for your family, and for them when they grow. Henry stepped a little closer. Let them talk. I carry this name now. His voice dropped. And I take responsibility for everything that comes with it, including you. Grace closed her eyes. She thought of her husband, of the river, of the waiting, of the babies in her arms, of the house she would leave behind. When she opened her eyes, the decision was already made. Yes, she said softly. Henry released a breath as if he'd been holding it for months. He stepped in and kissed her with care, not as someone who takes, but as someone who promises. The babies cried. They laughed, pulled apart. Grace took Thomas, Henry took William. And there, in the middle of that small house, scented with wood and warm milk, something improbable took shape. Not a perfect tale, but a family. Epilogue, 6 months later. The wedding was small, the kind that does not try to persuade anyone. It simply happens. It simply exists. Grace's father, his eyes bright as though he could finally breathe after so many funerals, led his daughter to Henry. There were few guests, close family, 2 or 3 men who had survived London's intrigues and still understood the value of silence, and Somerville's oldest servants gathered at a careful distance, curiosity held in check. And, of course, Thomas and William. The boys cried through much of the ceremony, deeply offended by the notion that anyone might speak for so long without offering to hold them. Henry took them into his arms at one point, Grace at another, the exchange seamless, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And perhaps that was the true scandal, the ease of it. Grace wore a simple gown of fine linen, cream-coloured, without excessive lace or showy jewels, nothing that shouted Duchess. Everything that said Grace. Henry murmured that she was perfect. She didn't quite believe him, but she stored the words where one keeps things that warm. Somerville was different when they returned. Henry had invested part of his inheritance in restoring the estate, like a man rebuilding a body after a long fever. The great house had been repaired with care, bright walls, a sound roof, windows that no longer let the wind cut through like a blade. The gardens were coming back to life slowly, as if someone had apologized to the land. The staff were paid on time and treated with firm fairness. The house breathed order. Even so, in the early days, Grace felt lost. There were too many corridors, too many doors, too many rules. And expectations no one voiced aloud, but that lingered in every lingering glance. Servants appeared and vanished with practiced efficiency. At times Grace felt she was standing in a space not made for her, and that the world expected her to notice and retreat on her own. But little by little, she found her place. She cared for the boys herself, to the discomfort of some older maids who murmured about what was or wasn't fitting for a duchess. Grace heard them and let them talk. Thomas and William were hers, and no one would decide for her how to love them. She managed the household with attention and fairness. She made mistakes. She learned. She asked when she did not know. Henry was always beside her, unhurried, without public corrections, without the kind of protection that humiliates, just presence. When the first formal dinners arrived, Grace nearly stepped back. She stood before the mirror, studying the green silk gown the dressmaker had prepared. She barely recognized herself. She looked like someone wearing a life that did not belong to her, as if the fabric had been meant for another woman, one who knew where to place her hands, when to smile, when to stay silent. Henry appeared behind her in the reflection, calmly adjusting his tie. "You look beautiful." "I look out of place." "You look exactly where you belong." Grace drew a slow breath, feeling the cold weight of the necklace against her skin. "And if I make mistakes? If I say something improper?" Henry cupped her face gently, the way he did when the boys woke crying and needed nothing but certainty. "Then you'll be you," he said, "and that's enough for me." She nodded, took his hand. They went down together. The dinner was not perfect. Grace confused titles, laughed too loudly when the other women only curved their lips, used the wrong fork more than once. And still, for a few moments, she almost allowed herself to believe she might survive it without losing herself. Then Lady Hawthorne spoke. It was at a table far too long, beneath chandeliers far too heavy, with glasses that gleamed like watchful eyes. Lady Hawthorne possessed the sharp elegance of someone who had never needed permission to exist. She studied Grace for a moment. Her hands, her short nails, the traces of labor no ring could fully erase. "It is unusual," Lady Hawthorne said, a thin smile playing on her lips as she examined Grace's hands, as though searching there for the source of the error. "A duchess who prefers to smell of milk and firewood." Silence fell with the precision of a blade. Some pretended to drink, others pretended not to have heard. Henry went utterly still across the table, his gaze darkening. Grace set her napkin down calmly. She looked at Lady Hawthorne without haste, without tremor, the way one looks at a storm when there is nowhere left to hide. "I prefer to smell of a living home," she said simply, "and so do my children." The silence that followed was different. It was not merely embarrassment, it was decision. It was hierarchy being redrawn in front of them all. Henry did not smile. He did not need to. He only raised his glass, as if sealing something without a speech. And that night, for the first time, Grace felt, not that she belonged to that world, but that the world was beginning to learn how to make room for her. Thomas and William grew. They learned to walk, then to speak. They called Grace mother, without anyone teaching them the word. She cried the first time, a brief embarrassed cry she tried to hide by turning away. Henry wrapped his arms around her from behind, laughing and moved, and kissed her temple as though that were a crown truer than any jewel. The seasons passed. Grace learned to move within society, still too direct for some, still awkward in certain drawing rooms. Some whispered that she was improper. Others tried to ignore her with studied coldness, but little by little she earned respect, not because of the title, but because of her presence, her fairness. The way no one around her felt diminished so that she might appear greater. Henry loved her in a steady, unshowy way. Grace felt it in small things, in the coffee prepared the way he liked it, which he only drank after making sure she had eaten, in the way he watched her read to the boys as if that sound were the music that had repaired the whole house, in her laughter echoing through Somerville's halls, a laughter that had never lived there before. One cold winter night, after they had put the children to bed, Henry took her hand. The fire crackled softly. The wind struck the windows without managing to enter. "You know what I think sometimes?" he asked. "What?" "That flood changed everything." Grace turned to him, her face lit by the fire. "You almost died." "But I found you." She touched his face with her fingertips, as if still confirming he was there. "I think of it too. If the rain hadn't come, if the bridge hadn't fallen, but it did, and it brought us here." Henry kissed her slowly. Outside, the rain began to fall, not violent like that spring storm, but steady, as if the sky were repeating an old story in a low voice. Grace listened to the sound of water on the roof and thought of the first night, the swollen river, the trapped carriage, the wounded man, the crying babies. She thought of mud and cold, and the fear that had followed her like a shadow. And she realized she was no longer afraid of the rain, not now, because when the storm came she would not be alone. She would have Henry, she would have Thomas and William, she would have a family. Henry pulled her closer, and his voice came like a simple promise without spectacle. "I love you." Grace closed her eyes, settling against him, feeling a warmth no title could buy. "I love you too." Outside, the rain kept falling, But inside that house, they were safe, together, at home. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it moved you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It truly helps these stories reach more hearts. And if you'd like to continue this journey, another story is waiting for you right here. See you in the next one. You in the B.